I've decided to go into the Psalms and to use the book of Psalms. I should tell you the translation I'm using here is the Jerusalem, the original Jerusalem. And the reason I'm using it is because I was planning on doing the Psalms, and this is the Bible I use devotionally. I think it is the most beautifully written in the English language. And so for that reason, when I study, I normally use a New American. Sometimes I use the American Standard, but I will use those for study because they actually are more accurate. But this is much more beautiful, and I use this one for my devotions. So a little bit about the book of Psalms. If you know anything about music, and you may never have thought of this before, but music goes through 3 stages. It's very common with any kind of music. I'll give you an example in my own background. When I was a young man, music that was considered totally on the periphery and way out on the end was Beatles. And so it was people looked down on. People who listened to the Beatles didn't really understand much about music and all that sort of thing. And then the Beatles moved into sort of an institutionalized thing. The first stage of the Beatles music, if you were to listen to the Beatles sing it, the words weren't actually always the same in the same songs. And you'll notice that with popular music that's going along like rapping, it isn't necessarily the same. It goes through this period of formation. And the Beatles music was that way. And then it moved into a period where it came to be more kind of accepted, and you would see things like concerts with the Boston Pops doing the Beatles and stuff. Now that was the most accepted. Now it is what we call crystallized. And so Beatles music has reached a certain point where you can actually hear it in elevators. Okay? And so, but all music goes through those 3 stages. This is one of the things that you need to understand. One of the real wonders of being my age is I will be dead before they're playing rap music in elevators. Okay? The thought of being trapped in an elevator with rap music is just, even the Nazis didn't do that to people. But so anyway, but to understand, all of music goes through these stages. And what happened with the Psalms, the Psalter of the Roman Catholic Church calls the book of Psalms the prayer book of the people of God. And so it is a collection of prayers, but it's actually hymns. It's much more proper to consider it a hymnal. And what happened was there were a bunch of things being formed, all of the Beatles. And when that began to become a little formal, then there was a whole new group forming. And then when this final one was crystallized as a book of the Bible, then the next one that was forming moved up and a brand new thing started forming. That went on 5 times. There are 5 sections to the book of Psalms, and each time they would finally reach a point where it was crystallized, and then no one could touch it or change it. But if you've noticed studying through the book of Psalms, sometimes you'll find 2 or 3 Psalms that are virtually the same, but slightly different wording. That's when they were going through the period of where the wording would be shifting. People liked both of them, so they became 2 hymns, okay? But this worked through. The use of hymns probably began with David, and to say that David is the author of all the Psalms would be crazy. To say that David is the author of most of them would be crazy. To say that David didn't author any of them would be just as crazy. David contributed to it. I want you to know that the oldest psalm we have found in written form actually appears in one of the temples in Egypt, and it is a hymn to the sun god. And what the Jews did, probably learned it. Incidentally, this temple was built while the Jews were in Egypt as slaves. So they probably heard it, they adapted it to Yahweh, and they carried it out, eventually moved in. Many of the Psalms are very, very old. Many of the Psalms way predate Judaism. Have you ever heard verses in the Psalms which say, "Our God is greater than all gods"? Yeah. That would never be written by a Jew. There's only one God. How could you say our God's greater than other gods? There are no other gods, okay? Our God is Lord of lords. There are no other lords, So many of the Psalms way predate Judaism. and reach way back into paganism before even Abraham. But over a period of time, they adapted them to themselves. And I want you to know that that's very common with regards to music in our own day. I think we bring an attitude to music. I'll tell you that one of the most beautiful experiences I had in my whole life was I was asked to do the funeral for a Carmelite nun. She had been in the convent over 70 years. So I mean, she was close to 100 years old. She'd been in the convent 70 years. And I don't know if many of you remember the song Unchained Melody. That was what she asked to be sung. And this whole idea of being in love with God and wondering, am I still yours? And the verse would go on and on. It was the most staggering thing. And to understand that you bring an attitude to music, and the attitude that we bring with regards to Scripture renders everything dealing with God. And again, another thing I'd mention, most music deals with only two topics. They deal with a love affair that works, which is grace, and a love affair that doesn't, that's sin. Pure and simple, okay? That's all of music. So anyway, we'll go through the Psalter. The Psalter probably was completed in its writing 200 years before Jesus. 200 years before Jesus, probably the last of the Psalms entered the Psalter. I'd like you to know that the first Psalm in the Psalter is in fact the newest. And Psalm 1 was written as an introduction to the entire book. Okay? So we'll begin with the first psalm, but I want you to know it was the last psalm written when the book was moved into the Scriptures. The thing about the Psalms, they're wisdom literature, and the basic theme of wisdom literature is contained within the first psalm. And the basic idea of wisdom literature is in human life there are two paths open to everyone. And people have different ways of choosing paths. One path, people choose a path to a goal. And let's say you decide you're going to be a doctor, and so your goal is to be a medical doctor. If your goal is to be a medical doctor, it will determine the classes you take, the schools you go to, and all, but it is goal-orientated. There's sometimes, probably the path is really easy. You go to a school you really like, have teachers you really like, this sort of thing. Sometimes the path is absolutely miserable. I don't know how many of you have ever attended an autopsy, but that's part of medical training, you know, and it's absolutely grotesque. But anyway, there's all different things, but your path is not chosen because it's easy or hard. It's chosen because of the goal. There are other people who always take the easy path, and that is totally destructive. Ultimately, you're destroyed. You're scattered if you always take the easy path. So in wisdom literature, and Bill Adams covered wisdom literature one time with regards to one of our seminars. And so to understand that's a basic thing of all wisdom literature, these two paths. And that's what we have. So this is Psalm 1, verse 1. Happy the person who follows not the advice of the wicked, nor loiters in the way that sinners take, nor sits about with scoffers. Okay? I'd like you to notice what they say. Happy the person who doesn't follow, who doesn't loiter, and who doesn't sit with regards to sinners. I'd like you to notice those three things. There's a path, as I mentioned, these two paths. The strange thing is the one who decides just to follow this path of ease, okay? And that person will never achieve happiness, okay? That person will always be on a destructive path. You choose the easy path, it's always destructive. So that person who follows it. The next one is the one who loiters. Who is the one who loiters? The one who actually keeps jumping back and forth between the two paths. Sometimes they'll choose the right path, and sometimes it just seems too difficult, so we take the other path for a while, this sort of thing. That person's never going to get anywhere either. And the third person is the person who can't make the choice, so they sit down, okay? They just sit there. And they never really make a choice. And they do not live. Life happens to them. And there are people, we all know people like that. Just life sort of happens to them, but they don't really live. And it says here, that is the sure way to unhappiness. Okay? The way to happiness is to pick a goal and follow it. Happy the person who does not do these things. The other thing I'd like you to notice there, because of the term happy, remember this is a beatitude. In the Bible, anything that begins with happy is a beatitude, and they are formulas for happiness. If you want to go through sometime, you have nothing to do, go through your Bible and highlight every verse that begins with happy is. Take those verses out, put them together, you have a total compendium for happiness in human life. There are 7 Beatitudes in the book of Revelation. Happy the one who reads and follows the advice of this book was the last one we had the other day. Okay? But there's 7 Beatitudes there. There are, I think, 9 in the teachings of Jesus. But you can find Beatitudes all the way through the Scriptures. So here it begins with a Beatitude. And then second it says, but happy is the one who finds his pleasure in the law of Yahweh and murmurs his law day and night. What he wants you to know here, understand that for the Jews, what you and I call the Bible, they call the law. Okay? So the law of Yahweh is basically, the Word of God. Happy the person who finds pleasure in the law of Yahweh. And I think one of the things to understand about the nature of a relationship with God is that God's ultimate will is that you should be happy. Completely and totally happy. That is what God's about, and that's what God wants to happen to you. Total and complete happiness. In human life, oftentimes we like to, we kind of think, what would God really want me to do at this time in this place? And do you know what God really wants you to do is what you would be most happy doing, provided there's no sin involved. That's all. And St. Augustine, his basic thing was the formula for human life is to avoid sin and be happy. That's all. Do you remember that, you're thinking that, I'd like to spend my life in a convent dedicated to God, spending my life in prayer. But I really, really love children. I enjoy children and would love to raise a child. You're supposed to get married, raise a child. That's what God's calling you to do. Well, wouldn't it be better to, be a nun in the convent and spend my time in prayer? If God wanted you to be a nun in a convent and spend your life in prayer, you would love the thought of being totally alone without a husband and child and there in the convent. If you love having a husband, you love raising children, that's a sign that's where you're supposed to be. You see, the God who wants you to be happy had the advantage of creating you in the first place. So basically, your formula for God's happiness is woven into what you really want to do. And I really like to point this out because a lot of Christians think they're holy because they're doing what makes them miserable. Okay? That is not what God's about, It's almost, if you're enjoying this, it's probably a sin, If you're really enjoying this, something's wrong. That is not anything God's about, okay? So we should find pleasure in God's law because my pleasure for my life is actually woven into His law somewhere. So I need to find my pleasure in God's law. And the next thing is to murmur it day and night. What does it mean to murmur it day and night? To be aware of God's law. And that's one of the principal reasons for the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms will take all kinds of things out of the world so that if you make it a habit, I suggest this to all of you because we priests do it. Priests read the entire book of Psalms every 4 weeks. We go through the whole thing endlessly, year after year after year. Because if you read the book of Psalms and make it yourself, It is impossible to walk in our world without seeing God everywhere, because that's what the book of Psalms does. So you get up in the morning, you look out at the beautiful sky, and you say, Word pours out the word today, night to night imparts knowledge. Not a voice nor a discourse whose voice is not heard. And you look at the stars. How can anyone look at the stars and not know the wisdom and the power of the Lord, who spreads the stars across the sky with a single move of his hand? I go through them endlessly. You basically are fixed with all these different things of the world in which we live that force you to go back to God over and over and over. So what you want to do is meditate on this. And now they say, this person, verse 3, is like a tree that is planted by water streams, yielding its fruit in season, leaves never failing. Success attends everything that is done. It is nothing like this with the wicked, nothing like this. The tree in the desert, if you are aware of the fact that in California, I think we basically live in a desert, but if you go around the hills of this area at the proper time, you can look up at the totally barren hills and you'll see little spots of green. And when you see little spots of green, that's where a spring is. You can see them on the hills. And you can see areas, you'll look in a valley, and you'll see everything dead. You see a long line of green that goes along. There's a river there. And an awful lot of rivers in deserts, are underground. There's no river on the surface of the ground. There's just a string of these trees whose roots are locked in to the river underneath. And if you and I trust in the world in which we live, there are times when this world does very well, and you will do very well and be very happy. There are times when this world is very bad, in which case I'll be very miserable and very unhappy. And we go through this cycle. Just like the plants that bloom in the spring and all die, in the fall. But it's not like that with the plant that's on the edge of the river. It's not like that with the plant that has its roots locked into the underground water. The plant with the underground water doesn't even care if it rains. Doesn't care what happens at all. The fact is, the power of this plant is at its root. And this plant will bear fruit every year, rain or no rain. This plant will be happy no matter what's going on. And that's what you and I are invited to do. We're invited to find our strength, everything in God, so that our future is powerful because of the hands that hold our future, not because of the way our future looks. It is because of the hands that hold our future. So if we can lock into this, we find this wonderful peace, this wonderful joy in human life, because in fact we are not caught in the changes and everything that go on in the world around us. And he says it's not like this with the wicked. And remember, the wicked here are not necessarily sinners, but they're talking about the distinction between the wise and the fool. So the fool who does not lock into this will never be happy. And they go through these cycles. It says these are like the chaff blown away by the wind. I think you know that the chaff is the shell that comes from the outside of grain. When you process grain, what you do is in the Mideast, you take the grain principally is barley. You spread barley on a rock and you beat it with sticks or straps. And each grain of barley is very much like a little tiny peanut. And when you hit it with a strap, it breaks this outside shell. And then when you throw the barley in the air, the shells blow off because the shells are lighter than the barley pearls. And the barley pearls fall down. You collect them. I don't know if you've ever been to a place where they process walnuts in California. But if you ever go to a place where they process walnuts, they have this huge machine. The walnuts roll onto a flat surface, so there's only one layer of walnuts, and a drop hammer drops. And the drop hammer is exactly the right size to be just a little lower than the walnuts. And what it does is shatter the shells of all of them. but it doesn't break the meat, shatters the shells. Then the walnuts are pushed onto a conveyor belt, and they come over to this huge opening where a massive wind is blowing out. And the walnuts go there, the shells blow off, the meat falls into a little can that lands in Safeway. Okay? Pure, simple process. Okay? Pure, simple process. But he says, and it's kind of, he says, life is like that. People of wisdom are like the meat that goes down and falls into the can and goes on. And people who are the fools in human life are like the shaft. They're just blown. Whatever the wind is at this time, wherever the wind goes, they go. Okay? And so there's nothing to it. He says, the wicked will not stand firm when judgment comes, nor sinners when the virtuous assemble. Okay? Of course not. That's because the virtuous took one path and the fools took the other. They aren't even in the same place. They will not, be, it's like, if you go on a Boy Scout, what do you call it? Something like that, where they have the trip where you have to go out, they send you off in a bunch of groups. You're all supposed to gather at one place following the plan written by some scout who I might point out was possessed when he read. But anyway, you follow these different routes, and you all arrive at the same place. But someone who isn't following the plan doesn't get there. I don't know if it's kind of off the topic. I don't know if there's the GPS has just made the most wonderful thing in the world for Boy Scouts, and it looks like a little GPS, and what you do is you go anywhere in the world, anywhere you are, and where you stand, you turn it on. And then anywhere you go at any time, it will direct you back to the spot where you turned it on. So like if you turn it on your campsite, you can go anywhere, do anything you want, and it will direct you back to the campsite where you turned it on. See, it's proof that Jesus was really an Eagle Scout. No one knew this before, but only an Eagle Scout would think. So it says that ultimately, following this path, the virtuous assemble, and they assemble in the presence of God. And the sinners then are not. It doesn't happen that way. And it says, for Yahweh takes care of the way the virtuous go, but the way of the wicked is doomed. And I'd like you to notice this. It's not that God dooms the wicked. It's that there is a path that God takes care of. And if you're on that path, He takes care of you. And if you're not on that path, He can't take care of you, because the path is what He takes care of. Sort of think of it if you're out in the, let's say you're living in Nevada or something, and they have terrible snows. You know that there are certain roads that they plow the snow off of, and certain roads that because of their remoteness, they don't. If you have an ounce of sense, you take a road they clear. If you don't take a road they clear, you're on your own, stupid. And this is basically what he's saying. He says, Yahweh takes care of this path. If you choose to go on another path, you're on your own, stupid. Okay. Psalm 2. He says, why this uproar among the nations? Why this impotent muttering of pagans? Kings on earth rising in revolt. Princes plotting against Yahweh and His anointed. Now let us break their fetters. Now let us throw off their yoke. This was written during the reign of Solomon. And Solomon saw the largest extent, basically, of the kingdom. And Solomon had authority over a lot of what we would call tributary states. And the tributary states were trying to figure out how to break free, how to get free of Israel. And so that's the background for this. But he says, why this uproar among the nations? And why does this whole thing, this impotent, this worthless muttering of the nations, and why do they look at the possibility of revolt? Because who could move against the one that God has appointed? And the idea is they're doing all these kinds of things, and the uselessness of the stupidity of it, that they would move against God. And And so they decide they're going to break the authority and they're going to throw off the yoke. They decide they're going to do all this thing. And what is the response of God? I'd like you to notice, this is very important to understand God's response and ours. It says, the one whose throne is in heaven sits laughing. Okay? Now, you know, when you and I see the rise of the Nazis against the church, or see the rise of the communists against the church, or see the rise of atheism in the United States today against the church, we see the rise of these different things. You know, they're terrifying to us. But they're only terrifying to us because we can't see the future. God thinks it's laughable, because the future belongs to God no matter what they're doing. So it just looks stupid to God. And so for God, it is simply laughable. So God in heaven laughs. No one thwarts God's plan. You simply can't do it. And so what they're about is absolutely silly. And so Yahweh derides them. And that's, Yahweh just dismisses them. God just dismisses them. Then angrily he addresses them. In a rage, he strikes them with panic. This is my king, installed by me on Zion, my holy mountain. Okay? And imagine God with all the things that are going on, let's say during the Holocaust, that God would look at the Jews and say, this is my people. I have established these as my people, and I will care for them forever, no matter what you do. And you look at the rise, you know, against the church of communism and atheism in our own day, and God looks at the church and says, these are my people. You can rise against them, do anything you want. I will care for my people forever. My people are under my care. Let me proclaim Yahweh's decree. He has told me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. I think you know that this is quoted several times in the Christian scriptures, with this idea of Jesus being the Son of God. You and I would see this in very Messianic terms. For the Jews, it's a reference to the king who is the son of David. Okay? But you and I would see this in very Messianic terms. Something you and I don't have much to do with in our own day. But in the ancient world, the idea of being a child was not as connected to genetics as you and I think. I'll give you an example. If I were a Roman, let's say I'm a Roman soldier, a centurion, and I have a wife, and my wife becomes pregnant and has a child. When my wife becomes pregnant and has a child, that is not my child until I designate that as my child. And when I designate that as my child, it becomes my child. Why was that? Because there might be some suspicion about whether it is your child. And the other side of that is there might be something defective about the child. And if the child, you know, in some way had a birth defect or anything, you would say, it's not my child. Okay? Because then they wouldn't be entitled to the inheritance. Another thing is, as a Roman soldier, suppose I'm in an occupation area, let's say occupying the city of Carthage. I have a sexual relationship with a woman in Carthage, and a child is born. It could well be that I don't want Roman citizenship for a child in Carthage, period. Then it's not my child. It could well be that I have no children. My wife and I are childless, and I want the child. Then I designate it as mine. It could be that I, as a Roman soldier, I have, let's say, a man and woman are both my slaves, and they have a relationship and they have a child, and they have a perfectly healthy son, and I've never had a son. I could designate that as my child, and then it becomes my child. Okay? We tend to think of, if you generate the child, it's your child. That wasn't true in the ancient world. Okay? And the more important you were, the more people whose right you had over, you could say, like the Roman emperor could look at anyone in the Roman Empire and say, that's my child. And then that child would be. You have to understand, that's what happened to God. I was born in San Diego to a man who was an engineer and a woman who was a registered nurse. And far from being wealthy, they were, very comfortable and everything, raised and everything in San Diego.